Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Planning Committee on this beautiful day. Can I just remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live via the internet and a recording archive for future viewing. Have any apologies for absence? I've already been told Peter King will be joining us. He's coming here, definitely. Move on to item 2, minutes of the last meeting. Moving note, thank you. Item 3, if I go round to my left, receive any declarations of interest. Councillor Cave.
Yes, I have a declaration of interest on item 2018/00133 full. I have a personal prejudicial interest in that the applicant is a client of mine and I should be leaving the room.
Thank you very much. Carrying on round. Anybody else? Councillor Parker.
Thank you, Chairman. I declare an interest on 2018/00398/RG3 Brecon Court, Barry. I'm Cabinet Member for Housing and Building Services, and that comes under my portfolio, so I will be leaving before that's considered.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Penrose.
I'll be declaring an interest on planning application 2018/00133 FUL, United World College of Atlantic, being a board member of St Donald's Arts Centre, which is part of the actual Atlantic College. I will be leaving the meeting for discussion.
Thank you very much. If there are no other declarations of interest, I'll move on. Okay, move on to item 4, building regulation applications under delegated authority. Move and note, thank you. Item 5, planning applications determined by... Sorry, Councillor Johnson.
Sorry, Chair. It's just a quick query. Page 13 has an application 2018/0086 FUL regarding Pennon Farm, Llancarvan, and we also have an application from 2011 later on in the bundle. I'm just checking whether there's any impact or relationship between the 2018 application, which has been dealt with under delegated powers, and the 2011 application, which we're dealing with later on today. I'm just checking that there's no overlap, nothing interesting to us as a committee.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure there's not, but perhaps Ian can fill us in.
Yeah, there's no overlap. The one is relation to a garage at the existing dwelling, and the one to be discussed later relates to a new dwelling on a different site, so they're completely unrelated.
Okay. Thank you for that note. So are we happy to move the planning application on delegated authority? Thank you. Item 6 is appeals. Vicky, do you want to speak at all on appeals?
Thank you, Chair. Just one appeal in the report this month that was to do with a solar canopy at the front of a residential property in Meadow Court and St Bride's Major. The council successfully defended that appeal and the appeal was dismissed. I also wanted to draw members' attention to the appeal statistics report, and you'll recall at the last meeting there was a request that committee determinations get noted in those statistics, so they have been included. That's on page 23 of the report. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no questions, ask those to be moved, please. Thank you very much. Item 7 is our delegated trees list. Move a note. Thank you. Item 8, under general planning matters, first item, or the only item, is a Section 116 Highways Act 1980 application to extinguish part of the highway at Highlight Lane off Laken Drive, Highlight Park in Barry. Vicky, can you introduce this one, please?
Thank you, Chair. So this is a relatively new one, I'm sure, on many of you around the table. We don't get many of these. This is essentially, we've been approached by the occupants of the two properties that front onto this land, which is currently within the adopted highway, and they have requested that we use our powers to extinguish that part of the highway. There are several reasons for them making that request in terms of nuisance and antisocial behaviour, which is set out in the report, that has been occurring on that land, and they obviously it's in front of their house, and they would like to be able to prevent things like fly tipping, lewd behaviour, and other sort of antisocial behaviour issues. We as a council have the power to can use our powers to submit an application to the Magistrates Court. It'll be the Magistrates Court that actually decide whether or not the highway is extinguished or not. What members of the Planning Committee are here to decide is whether or not that application is made. So either whether we make the application, or we make the application with amendments as proposed, or we do not make the application. As you'll see from the recommendation, it's recommended to make the application subject to an amendment to reduce the area of the highway to be extinguished, and that's in accordance with the amended draft order as set out in the attached Appendix B of the report. Some members did attend the Planning Committee site visit this morning, where we did have a look at the highway in question, and I think it became clear from there, which may not necessarily be clear from the plan, that there's quite a large area which adjoins the properties on Sherborne Close, where they back onto it. From the plan, you might assume that that area is flat, but actually there's quite a difference in levels to what you would think of as the road and those properties, and it's largely overgrown. And then what remains is basically a track, but it does form part of the adopted highway. As you'll see from the officer's recommendation, we are recommending that the application is made, and it seems a reasonable request to us. We've also got officers here from Public Rights of Way and from Highway, so if there are any technical questions, because there is a public right of way at the end of what is the existing adopted highway, and it's obviously intended that public right of way is maintained, so if we do extinguish the highway, that there is still a public right of way along it to join up to the existing one.
Before we move on to our speakers, I just want to note the Matters Arising paper, which is an objection letter received from, co-signed by one of our speakers, which you have had all circulated yesterday evening, and is printed in front of you. So I'll move on to our public speakers. I'll first ask Mr. Robert Hort, if you'd like to take your seat up there, sir. When you turn the microphone on and start speaking, you'll have 3 minutes. When you're ready, thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me?
Sorry, you've turned off your microphone now, sir. If you could just turn it back on.
Okay, that's it on.
There we go. I can hear you now.
Sorry, I thought I'd keep my finger on the button. Yes, Mr. and Mrs. Lakin have made this application for that piece of land to be extinguished on the grounds of antisocial behaviour, fly tipping. There is no proof of any of that. In my second letter to the council, I note it isn't in your file or bundle. I do have a copy of it here, or 2 copies, and that was the letter of the 22nd of June.
Sorry, sir, I'll pause the clock there just to explain what I said prior to you starting to talk. That's the letter that we've circulated to members, the Matters Arising point. So everyone has got a copy of that, and they've read it from last night.
I wasn't sure whether it was that one.
No, that's fine. I just thought I'd clarify, so you weren't wasting your time talking about that. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, that's fine. So that is sort of self-explanatory in there of the issues I have with this piece of land being extinguished. Plus the fact that I believe that it's going to be under development, not just solely for the antisocial behaviour, lewd acts, and fly tipping. Fly tipping, I have never seen it down in Highlight Lane. Antisocial behaviour, well, that's a police matter. And is there any evidence of antisocial behaviour? Because it will be recorded by the police if there is. So I don't believe there's a lot of backbone in that argument at all. And if that is the only argument, well, I don't think it's correct that the council should extinguish this piece of very valuable land, a ransom piece of land, and used by the public and enjoyed by the public. What else have I got to say here? There is a lot I could say at this present time, but I won't expand on what I will have to say if this goes to the court. So I'll leave my thoughts with you there with this letter, and also the fact that soundproof is needed to allow the council, I believe, to say that antisocial behaviour, fly tipping, if the lane is shut off or extinguished, then that is only going to move the problem further up the lane, if that is the case. And like I say, I don't believe it's the case. Because all the time I've been down there building, there's people walking up and down there with their children going down to the
Thank you, sir. That is your 3 minutes now.
Okay.
And as I did say, as you've acknowledged, the committee have that letter, which is very detailed. Thank you for submitting that. It's very helpful to the committee when that happens. Are there any questions or clarification that the committee have for our speaker, Mr. Hort? No, thank you. If you want to take your seat back down there. Thank you. Yeah, turn it off, that's fine. Mine works either way. So. Oh, you turn it back on. Okay, that's fine. Have a seat. I now ask our second speaker, Mrs. Tina Lakin, speaking in favour of the application. If you take your seat, you will have 3 minutes when you're ready to start speaking.
Today's report and documentations before you set out the reasons fully for the application and why it's not necessary to keep the said road as a public highway. A particular note at parts 7 to 16 of the report. The council officers are in support of the application, having seen proof of all the documentation from myself and my husband as regards ownership, etc. There is in fact precedent set by 2 previous applications, one both made by neighbours. The first resulted in 4 houses being able to extend their gardens as far as the lane, and the second, though approved by South Glam as it was at the time, didn't proceed when the neighbours realised the ground would revert to the landowner and they'd have to purchase it. Theirs was an identical request to that before you today. Put simply, it's not necessary, as evidenced by the fact that nothing will change for the highway users from point B onwards. The road from point B to point A leads nowhere except to our yard, holiday lets and access to our homes. It serves no purpose other than for that access. Vehicles who reach point A have to reverse to point B now, unless they trespass onto our land, if they are able to do so because the gate is open. So in effect, nothing will change, except unauthorised vehicles will be stopped at point B where they can immediately turn or reverse. There will be no increased traffic or parking issues. As pointed out, it is a single track road with no parking. This fact exists and was in existence when the objectioner purchased his home and land, and so he was aware fully of the position at that time. I would point out that St Agnes has a large open driveway suitable for any Tesco or delivery lorry to turn or park on. The simple fact is it can't because the owner has parked an unused vehicle and a digger on their driveway preventing this. Perhaps your site visit this morning you noted that. The objectioner mentioned the taxpayer. There is a large cost to the local authority in maintaining the road, the verge, tree cutting and dealing with encroachment from neighbours. This is over a number of council departments. This will cease if extinguishment happens and will therefore save money for the council in these times of austerity. As a result, the objectioner can't prove to the council the road is necessary. It would only be so if there would be a loss of benefit to the public road user, which there is not here. The amended plan deals with any concerns the objectioner may have with regard to lorries, turning, etc. Finally, it is necessary to extinguish this highway and stop the unlawful activity. The latest incident only a few weeks ago when my son opened his front door to be greeted by an A to B taxi driver urinating. When approached and asked to leave, he did so, and I'm grateful that on this occasion he didn't threaten to smash my son's windows as has happened in the past.
Thank you very much. That's 3 minutes, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Has the committee got any questions or clarification before I ask Mrs. Lakin to step down? Okay, thank you, madam.
Thank you.
Take a seat back down there. Before I open it to the committee, Vicky?
Thank you, Chair. Just to confirm that the reason why this report is before committee is because we have received objections. If we hadn't had any objections, the normal process would be that it would just be submitted to the courts directly. And the key consideration really is whether or not the adopted highway actually serves any useful purpose now as an adopted highway. Clearly the element that we are talking about being extinguished is just serving the 2 properties that have actually asked for it to be extinguished. There is no turning facility within that extent of the adopted highway, and therefore, as the report sets out, there's no exacerbation of what is the existing situation.
Thank you. Councillor Rowlands.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to, because obviously not many of us have dealt with one of these, just to get some more information about when it goes to court, the objectors, are they allowed to submit their objection when it goes, obviously, to be considered by court?
Yes, at the hearing in the Magistrates' Court, the objector has already submitted his objection, can present his objection to the judge or magistrate who hears it, and there's still an open platform for anybody else who has an objection to bring it forward at that time.
So, I mean, in terms of our discussion here, it is about whether or not the highway remains useful to the council's highway network or not. And therefore, are we willing to put it forward? And the debates about ownership, legalities, accusations of incidents that will be dealt with by the courts. Councillor Bird.
Chair, if nobody else has got any questions, I'd move that we go with the officer's recommendation of the amended plan.
Thank you. I've got a second from Councillor Parker. Councillor Thomas.
Just a question for information, really. If in the future, I note from the application and from the site visit this morning that there's a number of properties actually off that particular stretch, which I understand are all in the ownership of Highlight Farm. What would happen in the future if, for example, Highlight Farm decided to split up the ownership of that and for it to go to? It's just for information. So I'm just curious.
James.
Yeah, if any of the I think one of the 4 properties that forms the Highlight Park complex is in separate ownership. If a further unit was sold off, what I would expect to happen through that process is that a right of way would be granted by the seller of the property to the new buyer over the private land, or depending on which bit was sold, it may be that the house being sold might actually have ownership of sort of that bit of road that's no longer adopted to form an access to their property.
Councillor Thomas?
Yeah, and on that, not on that particular bit, on the right-of-way, that is included in conditions that the public right-of-way that runs through this particular stretch of lane is retained in perpetuity, yeah?
Yeah, there's provision within section 116 for a reservation for a public right-of-way. So where in this instance you have a public right-of-way that currently extinguishes or becomes part of the adopted highway because it still forms rights of walking, we can then extend the public right-of-way to the point of the extinguishment and maintain that, and the landowners agreed that. Yeah, it's within the order.
Okay, with that, unless there is anyone else, I'll move that to a vote on the motion to go with officer recommendations, which is to submit to the magistrates Plan 2 within the report. All those in favour? And that's unanimous. Thank you very much. That passes. Moving on to our next item. The public speakers on our last application, you're very welcome to stay, but equally you can leave the chamber now if you don't wish to watch the other 4 applications we have in front of us. Okay, so planning applications. Our first one is titled 2011/00991/OUT, Pen on Farm in Llancarvan. Vicky? Ian.
Okay, this is an outline application for an agricultural workers dwelling at Pen on Farm. As you'll see from the report, the application was originally reported to committee in 2012 alongside another application, 2011-1021, which was to relocate the farmstead. Now, since at that committee, there was a resolution to approve the application subject to conditions and subject to a legal agreement. Since that time, for personal circumstances of the applicant and issues to do with timescales, in respect of some barn conversions that were part of the farm, the issues have dragged on. The legal agreement hasn't been signed, and we're here for some 6 years later, and the application remains undetermined. In the last year or so, the applicant has approached the council with a proposal to vary the terms of one of the conditions that was on the previous resolution, and also to remove the requirement for the legal agreement. So in essence, the first condition of the resolution back in 2012 was that work couldn't commence on the construction of the dwelling until such time as the 2 largest buildings on the farmstead, which are, well, they're called H and I, but they're these sort of greeny ones on the plan, until they were built. The applicant contends that that's an overly onerous requirement, and in terms of the financing of the relocated farmstead, it's not possible for those buildings to be built before work starts on the farm because of the financing of the dwelling. He also contends that the legal agreement isn't necessary because Technical Advice Note 6 sets out the circumstances where legal agreement will be required, and in instances like this, the TAN says that there shouldn't need to be a legal agreement which requires the dwelling to be specifically linked to the farm in question. Rather, it should just be a rural enterprise dwelling or an agricultural dwelling available for occupation by a qualifying person. So we've considered those issues and we're reporting it back now, and the recommendations for approval, subject to a varied condition 1 and subject to a recommendation that a legal agreement isn't necessary. The varied condition 1 suggests that it would be reasonable to limit the construction of the dwelling until such time as buildings B, C, D, E, F and G, which is the cluster closest to the site of the dwelling. On the plan, it's kind of the multicoloured section closest to the little red line outline. We're suggesting that, subject to the external elevations of those buildings being constructed, that is a reasonable point at which it would be justified for the dwelling to be commenced. That's also having regard to the fact that the animal stock levels are at a point where there's a clear functional need for the dwelling. 2 of the other buildings approved by the other consent have been constructed, and a significant amount of work has taken place on site, which demonstrates the clear intentions of the applicant to develop the farmstead at this location. The report sets out the functional need now versus 6 years ago, so stock levels are slightly different, but the table on page 69 shows the makeup of man hours and concludes that there's a clear labour requirement. The technical advice note sets out a series of other tests for us to consider in terms of financial test, whether there's other dwellings that could satisfy the need, whether other normal planning requirements are met in terms of visual impact. The bulk of those remain unchanged from previously. It remains a sound established agricultural enterprise. Highways issues remain unchanged. The siting of the dwelling remains unchanged. There remain no other dwellings within the unit that could meet the need, hence the recommendation to approve.
Thank you, Ian. We've had no public speakers. In fact, none of the planning applications have any speakers registered to speak, so I'll open it to the floor. Councillor Parker.
Yeah, thank you. Ian, just by help really, condition 6B, which is a person or persons who would be eligible for consideration for affordable housing under the local authority's housing policy, or a widow, widower or surviving civil partner of such persons, and to any residents. This covers the occupancy of the dwelling. My query is quite clearly that the cases put forward means that it's going to be occupied by an agricultural worker, and I wonder whether or not, should it fail, that should really be should not be in at this stage, but should come back by way of a separate application. But it's more of an academic interest than a definite interest.
Okay, so the condition would require the applicant to demonstrate that there aren't eligible occupiers. Now this, as put forward here, is the standard wording recommended by the technical advice note, which just gives greater scope for occupancy of the dwelling prior to it just reverting back to being a market house in the countryside. So if it can't be occupied by a qualifying person in a rural enterprise, the next best is somebody that would help partially meet the council's rural affordable housing need in the area. So that's what the town recommends, and that's what we tend to put on these as standard now.
Helpful and an object lesson, thank you.
Councillor Thomas.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to ask a similar point to Andrew's, but he's covered that. But I was also interested to know what has happened to the application for the two buildings H and I that are no longer there and not proposed to be being put up first. And presumably it's over 5 years ago, so they'd need to be reapplied for.
Okay, so buildings H and I form part of application 2011-1021, which was an application for all of the other buildings there. So that consent has been implemented. So there will be no further consent required for those buildings. It's just that they are not the first buildings that the applicant has built there. They're in essence the largest and probably the most costly buildings to construct. Other buildings further down the site have been built, and we're advised that in the course of the next couple of months, construction of the buildings at the top end near to the site of the dwelling will be constructed. Once the dwelling is constructed, we have to bear in mind this is an outline application, and the applicant will need to apply for reserved matters consent for the detailing, appearance, etc. Assuming that happens and that's approved, and the applicant can then commence work on the dwelling, that then eases the financial position in terms of financing of the larger buildings. But even without those buildings, there will be adequate facilities with the buildings B through G for temporary housing of animals. So the larger two, H and I, they will be long-term, the buildings that would house the animals, but the buildings are fairly multi-purpose initially, and that need can be met by other buildings in the short term. I should add that the applicant has made reference to another example of a broadly similar application in the Vale, where a relocated farmstead and new dwelling was approved, and they've cited the fact that a condition of this type wasn't put on that consent. Now, obviously, we consider all of these applications on their merits, but we have had regard to that, and typically, when we're looking at an established large agricultural enterprise, we don't tell farmers they have to get all the buildings there before they can build a house. The tests are there to establish that it's a reasonable and genuine enterprise, and for that reason, then the farm typically would build out the farmstead in the most appropriate way for the needs of the business. So yeah, they won't need to apply again. They can build them subsequently once they've commenced the dwelling.
Thank you very much. In that case, I've got no problem with the application.
Are you moving off to recommendations? Okay. Councillor Penrose?
Yeah, worryingly, I can remember sitting on the committee for the first application. I can remember it. I can't remember if it was deferred actually, but I remember a new report being done by Reading because the first recommendation was to refuse. The second report from Reading put a new light and complexity, but if I remember, the farmer claimed that the house in its existing location wasn't workable, nor were the buildings, and it had to be done for the viability of the farm. And yet 5 years later, we're still looking at the same application, which begs a query. I haven't got a particular problem with it, but similar to Councillor Thomas, to me, the planning permission that's given is obviously expired for that property, so this must be an actually new planning application, not an alteration to the previous plan application.
So the application has never been formally determined, so it's been an ongoing application. It's fair to say, going forward, I think we're going to take steps to ensure that where there are outstanding legal agreements, they don't drag on for this length of time, and that they either revert quickly or they're dealt with on the basis of the legal agreement not being signed, if whatever implications that would have. I think it's probably fair to say the applicant wouldn't have envisaged this length of time elapsing, and as I alluded to, there have been personal circumstances which have affected that, and as a consequence the numbers of animals, etc., had gone down. It's now been restocked again, but I would suggest back at 2012 the applicant would have envisaged needing to move to the new farmstead more quickly to maintain a business of that size. The fact that it's been able to go on that long, remaining partially at the old site, is probably reflective of the fact that there's been an impact on stock numbers in the meantime.
Thank you, Ian. I've got Councillor Parker, then I'll move it to a vote on the resolution.
Really, by way of clarification again, on page 77, which is the application site, it actually only refers obviously to the immediate area around it. Now, I would have thought that really I should have a blue line on there, and I'm looking on page 80, which shows the extent of the farm, because obviously they're tying this piece of land and the fact that it's going to be tied to the farm. So really, by clarification as to why you're happy this way rather than a large site plan showing the full extent of the agricultural unit. Thank you.
Yeah, the blue lines on that plan on page 77, they are part of the blue land in total, which does take in that land, and the application site for the application for the relocated farmstead is the strip of land as the linear strip, and also has the blue land as a whole, taking in the whole holding.
With that, move to a vote on the motion moving officer recommendations. All in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you very much. Moving on to our next application, 2017/00892/FUL, number 246 Halton Road in Barry. Vicky.
Thank you, Chair. So this application is a retrospective application to retain works that have converted the existing building to form a total of 5 self-contained flats at 246 Halton Road, Barry. As you can just see from the photographs, I think, hang on, sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. This is what the premises used to look like. It's been converted, as you can see. There was previously planning permission for the ground floor to be converted, but that planning permission has not been implemented. So the principle of residential use on ground floor has previously been accepted. It is within the settlement boundary of Barry. It is a place where we allow conversions to flats, but fundamentally the issue here is to do with access to amenity space to serve residents' needs for the basics, drying clothes, bin stores, cycle storage, that sort of thing. Our supplementary planning guidance on these says that they are, basic bare minimums, that must-haves. There are some circumstances where we have been flexible on those matters in the past. So, for example, in the core retail area of Halton Road in Barry, where you've got retail premises at ground floor that use service yards at the back, and there is no ability to have any provision for upper floors to have any amenity space, then we have allowed some flats in very limited circumstances there, but elsewhere throughout the Vale we have taken a strict approach to ensuring that all future conversions do have access, so that at least someone's got a place to store their bin. We've been successful at appeal where we have refused applications on those grounds, and some of those examples are set out in the report. In this case in particular, there is a clear option, a feasible option to enable access for all 5 flats to access the rear area. So at the moment the application proposals only allow for the 2 ground floor flats to have access to the backyard. As shown on page 123, there's a clear internal arrangement that would, yes, it would mean losing a small part of the internal accommodation for one of the ground floor flats, but it would obviously enable all of the 5 flats to access that rear service yard. We didn't think that was a particularly onerous ask of the applicant to implement that, but unfortunately they were not willing to put that forward, that proposal. The reason it is here at Planning Committee, we could have determined to refuse the application under delegated powers, but it needs committee authorisation to serve an enforcement notice. There's little point in us refusing a planning application unless we're also minded to be taking enforcement action, given that it's a retrospective application. So therefore it's a dual recommendation to refuse the application and to serve an enforcement notice for the cessation of the residential use of the ground floor of the building and the use of the 1st and 2nd floors of the building as 3 self-contained flats.
Thank you, Vicky. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that introduction. It's not in my ward, it's across the road from my ward, but I remember this coming to Barry Town Council and being present in the audience, and in Barry Town Council, I think it's mentioned on page 119, have some objections which are all the same things, I think, which the planning officer has just referred to. So I mean, I'm perfectly happy to move those recommendations. So I think that while I think these sort of places should be, there's no objection to residential for these sites. Sort of the way this has been done, I think, has been quite poor.
Councillor Drake.
Well, it is in my ward. I know the site well, and I've tried to go around the back to see the extension, but unlike my colleague who could run up lanes, shinning up walls and going up a gate, is beyond me these days. But I totally agree with this. I think it's appalling that these people won't have those kind of facilities. You feel embarrassed now, are you? And I totally agree with the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Drake. And for those who missed out on the site visits, we have a soundtrack for Councillor Wilkinson. It's the Benny Hill theme tune. She runs up to assist my vice chair in finding the right site. So a selfless act, and thank you for your contribution, Councillor Drake. I don't think there's anything the officers need to come back on. Councillor Parker.
Yeah. Are they occupied at present? No. Okay. Because they are. Yeah. Well, in that case, and it might not be relevant to planning, but I would point out the obligations under building regulations, which I'm sure are being considered in terms of sound, means of escape, fire, etc., etc. And bearing in mind it's a 3-storey building, and looking at the little suggested means of escape or partial means of escape, I just draw attention to it and rest on that, if I may.
Do you want to say anything, Vicky?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the building control case on this one and whether or not it has or hasn't got the necessary. But what would normally happen when we deal with retrospective applications like this is that planning automatically talk to building control and vice versa. So I expect they are fully aware of it, and if not, I will make a mental note to make sure they are anyway.
Councillor Thomas next.
Yeah, were this to be coming to us as a proposal rather than a fait accompli, would we not be talking about planning gain as well in Section 106 contributions, as it's going from 1 to 5 units?
In Barry, it's 5 or more units generally, so it's a net gain of 5 or more units. So I'm assuming there was at least already 1 residential unit. There are also provisions in terms of conversion which make viability more difficult, which is normally about 2 units, I think. Don't think that necessarily applies in the Barry case. but no, I don't think this is one that we would be looking for planning obligations for those reasons. It doesn't breach the threshold in Barry.
Councillor Johnson.
Just very quickly, because there's a reference made to conversations between planning and building control. Obviously, this is currently being this is currently has residents, has people living and paying presumably rent inside there. Then I'm just clarifying what happens in sort of in the terms of this retrospective planning application and how that housing issue is dealt with, and where those conversations take place. Because if there are 5 people who, with no disrespect, are this is not the most luxurious accommodation that I've seen in the Barry area, I'm just checking that those people will be appropriately accommodated and their situation sorted as well.
Obviously, I don't know the personal circumstances of the tenants or the occupiers of these properties. We normally make sure that any enforcement notices give appropriate time limits where it is talking about the cessation of a residential use. We give a reasonable time period to allow people the opportunity to find alternative accommodation.
Councillor Bird.
I mean, realistically, if he wouldn't have to kick anybody out if he just agreed to put in that corridor in. And it could be done with people living there. It's not a complex and long job. It's just he's being stubborn and refusing to do the work. So.
Okay, we've had the move off to recommendations. Can I see all those in favour? It's unanimous. Again, thank you very much. That passes. I'll give us a moment for those who are withdrawing from the next application to make their way out of the room. So our next planning application is 2018/00133/FUL United World College of the Atlantic, East Drive in St Donats. Vicky.
Thank you, Chair. So thank you to those members that attended the site visit this morning, which was really beautiful on a day like today. So it was well worth the trip out to the lovely Heritage Coast. The plan up on the screen now, hopefully you can see it. This is a proposal to demolish 2 existing buildings that are on the site and replace them with some relatively large 2 big blocks of sorry, let me get the figures. Dormitory accommodation for students, which comprises 12 4-bedroom accommodation blocks and 2 3-bedroom apartments. They are cited on Site K and Site H on page 128 of your report. You can see those. They are within the grounds of the St Donats Castle and Atlantic College. At present, there are a whole range of different buildings and accommodation blocks in this vicinity that are starting to look quite old and in need of repair and replacement. So this is part of a programme of works really that the college want to do to upgrade their facilities for their students. It is a sensitive setting in terms of it being in the Heritage Coast. There are a number of trees that are affected by the proposal, and therefore replacement landscaping scheme has been conditioned. In terms of ecology, NRW and our ecologist are satisfied with the mitigation strategy, and conditions are imposed regarding that. As we saw today on the site, they are going to be big buildings, but the levels mean that the one in particular on Site H on the plan will actually be set into the ground quite substantially there. And they will largely be screened from outside the site by existing the majority of trees to be retained. You could just about glimpse from where we were on the site. You could just about glimpse the sea in the distance. So if you're out on the channel, you might well be able to see the buildings. But other than that, they are discreetly located in terms of the site itself, and given the existing use and that facility and the importance of that facility, these are works that are really needed for that facility to continue to be the centre of excellence that it is for education. And we feel that they've done the best they can in terms of design and siting of the buildings to minimise their impacts in what is a sensitive setting.
Thank you. Once again, we don't have any public speakers. Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the site meeting as well this morning, because that did put it in context of where these buildings are going to be. It was interesting that there is talk about some of the trees being removed. However, there will be a substantial number of trees that will remain, which will continue to provide screening for these developments. I know that we brought this to the committee because of an objection, basically because of a neighbour concerned about the additional noise or whatever from the youth at the site. But we've been notified that there isn't an increase in the number of students at the college, so the numbers still remain. I do believe with the design of the properties and the screening and the distance from the neighbouring property, it shouldn't really be an issue. I understand that if there is any issues with noise or whatever, then that will be dealt with under environmental health. So on the basis of the fact that there hasn't been the house, the accommodation is slightly closer, but it's not. When you compare the existing accommodation, then we're talking of a few metres rather than up upon it. And I don't think it affects the amenity of the property next to the site. So in my view, looking at the evidence today, I move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. Second over here. Just to clarify, I think this is in front of the committee just to the scale of it rather than necessarily because there was any particular objection. Turn your microphone off for me. Councillor Parker.
Thank you, Chair. I want to refer to P4 and the block elevation, which I think for K is S2. On P4.
Which page are we on? Sorry.
Sorry, we're on page. Sorry. I've got.
You got the site visit maps.
Give me a second.
Which are available if you attend the site.
There we are. Site K on page 128, and I think if Ian can call it up. Can you get to that, Ian? Detailed site plan, yeah. No, not that one. Keep going. Keep going. That's it. Whoops, no. No, it's the next one, sorry. It's the survey drawing. P4. That's the one. Now, my concern is that if you look at the elevation, the north elevation, it's got windows which literally touch the screen of trees between this building and the highway. And as you drive from the north end, you actually will see this bank of trees. At some time in the future, there could well be a temptation to try and remove those trees because they almost touch or get very close to the windows. So all I'm suggesting is we haven't got a specific TPO on those because it's covered by a general, but it would be maybe prudent to actually look at those trees to preserve them so that there's no temptation to open up that elevation to the main highway. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Parker. Vicky?
Sorry, yes. So I have got in front of me the tree protection plan, which clearly demonstrates which trees are being retained and which are going. They've done a full tree survey demonstrating what trees need to be removed to make room for the building. The trees are covered by a tree preservation order, so any future works to those would require planning permission. So I don't think we can preempt, sorry, not planning permission, would require consent under a TPO application. So I don't think we can preempt that. And obviously it is somewhat different to a house. If this was someone's private home so close, I think that there would be more pressure for what you're talking about, but given that it's student accommodation, the site itself is very enclosed, and that's part of the sort of character of the site and what they're looking for, I think. So yeah, we'll have to consider those in the future, but I'm not concerned that the proposal at the moment will undermine those trees.
I fully understand and accept that, and I flag it up by way of a concern for by way of, because I quite often use that road, and if those trees disappeared, we'd actually see this elevation, which then would become very incongruous within the setting of the historic gatehouse and the other buildings. So I'm content with that. Thank you.
Unless there's anyone else, I'll move vote on officer recommendations as moved. All in favour of the application? It's unanimous. Thank you very much. Before we move on to our next application, I'll wait for our 2 colleagues to join us and for 1 colleague to leave us. Okay, moving on to our final planning application, 2018/00398/RG3, Brecon Court in Barry. Is Ian? Ian.
Okay, this is an application, a full application for 28 residential units at the site of the former Brecon Court on Cornwall Road in Barry. The site previously accommodated 34 flats. This proposal, the site is now flattened. This proposal is for 28 units of 4 3-bed houses, 9 2-bed houses, 15 flats, of which 13 will be 1-bed. The plan on the screen shows the layout, which involves a row of houses fronting Cornwall Road. To the other side of the vehicle access, a further row of 4 houses perpendicular to Cornwall Road, then a block of 15 flats towards the rear of the site. Access is in a broadly similar position to where the former development was accessed from, and that leads to a shared surface area and 31 parking spaces accessed off it to serve the 28 units. There's 2 areas of public open space within the site, one in the sort of northern corner behind the 4 dwellings, and another one in the sort of southeastern corner just below the block of flats. So the recommendation is to approve, subject to conditions. I think that's all.
Thank you. Councillor Wilkinson.
As it's my area, I can't wait for this to start. It was a shame that Brecon Court had to go. The residents were so content there. They had a nice atmosphere and they didn't really want to move, but the building was not safe. It had to be got rid of. It's a shame, but I can't wait. There is going to be houses and that's what we need. It's a nice area and I can't see anybody. I haven't had any complaints and I just wish it would start now, this very minute. Thank you.
So you're moving off.
I move in recommendation, yeah.
Thank you. And a second, beat to it. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Of course, I'm sure everybody's going to be speaking. I hope everyone's speaking in favour of this proposal. A couple of points, though. I mean, there were 34 flats on site. There are now 28. This is a net loss of 6. So although it's positive that we are having these back, there is a net loss of 6 compared to the situation originally. I do note that we use the same agent for this as a council as the council leader was using for an application on his property last time. I wonder where the recommendations go. I would also like a broad comment about the pre-application consultation, which has been picked up by Barry Town Council. It's a comment I've made regarding other pre-application consultations. There doesn't seem to be a great deal of difference between the proposals in the pre-application consultation and what you get back. Usually, this is the second time where it feels like there is that the complaints or rather criticisms put forward in the pre-application consultation stage are justified, and I think the Barry Town Council phrase is glibly justified back at you afterwards, rather than seeing much of a difference. So I'm flagging that up because obviously this is something that came in as a result of the 2014, is it planning out to 2015? And this is something that's going to come to us time and time again, and I just want to make sure that that when those things come forward, that we do look at them properly and that they are taken seriously rather than just box ticking, which is what it's felt on a couple of occasions now. Just one final question regarding the site. There's a lot of reference to the visibility, etc., etc. I have had a comment from a resident on Barry Road because Barry Road has different parking restrictions, largely because of its proximity to the junction with Doven Road, with the football club, and the Court Road depot opposite. And they often, this resident says that they use the lane to the rear of Barry Road in order to access their garages. So their concern was about the ability to turn into the lane, not being affected by any of the development whilst on site or afterwards, and being able to go in and out of that space, sort of once the work has been completed.
Okay, I'll get Ian to respond on those points.
Yes, you're right. It is a slight deficit relative to the previous number. I mean, that's a consequence of the mix and type of units being adjusted on the site to better reflect what the more acute need is for. So it's obviously a combination of houses and flats. So inevitably, with houses, gardens, it's going to be slightly lower density, but it's considered to be the most appropriate mix to meet local need. In terms of Barry Town Council, yeah, there was an objection listing a series of points. It's pretty fair to say that between the pre-application consultation and the application, that the scheme is largely the same. Obviously, the applicant is not obliged to change the scheme. They have to consider whether they think there's reasonable points and whether they warrant changes. I mean, some of them were points of comment and question in terms of whether there's enough disabled parking spaces, whether there should be fire escapes. I mean, some of the more core planning points, like is it overdevelopment, the size of the flats. It is relatively dense. I mean, flatted developments usually are. We need to make efficient use of land, balancing that with amenity and size of buildings, but we need to make efficient use of land, and the standards in terms of distance to windows and things like that, they are adhered to here. So while the residents to the northeast will have an outlook of a larger building than they would have done previously, we still feel it's still an acceptable outlook. It's not unduly hemmed in by the building. So Barry Town Council comments fully taken on board, but in this case it was felt that the development was acceptable notwithstanding those. In terms of the highways points, the lane is unaffected by the development. The development isn't reliant on the lane for access. There is a condition for a construction environmental management plan, so we can ensure through the construction plan that the construction works are programmed in a way that it doesn't unduly affect access to the lane and things like that. So I'll make a particular note to be ready for that point when the CEMP comes in.
Councillor Wilkinson.
It was similar to that point there I was going to say about the lane. I asked her on the site visit to make sure that lane was going to be able to be used, and at the one end it was closed off because we used to have racing through there with cars and everything. So it's staying as it is, and they will be able to access their garages and into their back gardens from Barry, the ones that's on Barry Road.
Okay. The development once complete doesn't make provision for any changes to the lane. I think the only potential scope for an impact will be during the construction process, and we'll be guarded of that.
With that in mind, if there are no other comments, I'll move to a vote on the motion, which is to move officer recommendations. All those in favour? And that's unanimous. Again, thank you very much. See you next time.